Hello, I'm Jacob from the Cedar Public Library, and you are watching In a Pickle, Experiments in Fermentation. And today I'm going to be making sour cabbage, otherwise known as sauerkraut. Fermented foods have a long and rich history in pretty much every human culture. One of the oldest is the salty wet cabbage dish, known as sauerkraut. While its name is German and fermented cabbage is a popular part of a number of Eastern and Central European cuisines, the origins date back nearly 2,000 years to ancient China. Known as suan tai, which literally translates to sour vegetable in Chinese, it is believed to have originally been made by laborers working on the Great Wall of China using cabbage fermented in rice wine and salt. This was done so they would have a source of food during the colder, non-farmable months. Somewhere in the next 1,000 years, the recipe for suan tai would slowly make its way across all of Europe, changing and evolving along the way. One of the major reasons for sauerkraut's eventual success in Europe was its utility in maritime expeditions. It turns out sauerkraut carries a rather large amount of vitamins C and K. And if you've ever read much about people living on ships for extended periods of time, you may have heard of a disease known as scurvy. While popular media may have told you it was mostly relegated to dogs, it's actually a debilitating disease human sailors got after prolonged periods of not getting enough ascorbic acid, a nutrient that also goes by the name of vitamin C. Ships that carried a large amount of sauerkraut on their voyages noticed an enormous drop in scurvy cases. So much so that by the end of the 18th century, pretty much every European navy had jumped on the sauerkraut bandwagon. So we know that fermenting cabbage was a cheap and apparently relatively simple process, but would it still be easy if I were the one doing it? I mean, probably not, but I have to try, right? Otherwise, this video is going to be both incredibly short and obscenely boring. So, first things first, we're going to measure out just over 2 pounds of red or green cabbage, in our case green. Then we're going to cut out the core. This core is both tough and bitter, two things that really don't seem all that conducive to making a good sauerkraut. From there, we're going to shred our cabbage using a large knife. That being said, you could absolutely ferment an entire cabbage, but for our purposes, I think we need it shredded. After that, it's time to start combining our ingredients. Well, all you really need to make sauerkraut is cabbage submerged in salty water. Various spices can be used in order to add your preference of flavors. For our next step, we are going to put our cabbage into a clean, non-metallic bowl. This is done because some metals, like iron and copper, react to acid inside the brine and create a metallic taste when left sitting over a long period of time. However, if all you have is stainless steel, feel free to use that as it doesn't really react to the acid. Next, we're going to add our spices. 10 juniper berries, 1 teaspoon of caraway seeds, 1 teaspoon of yellow mustard seeds, and then 1 teaspoon of peppercorn. And finally, 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. The recipe said pickling salt, but I used Himalayan pink salt. And as long as there aren't any major additives, it should be fine, right? Once all those are added, we're going to mix/stir our ingredients together. Then we're going to let it rest for about 10 minutes so that the salt can start releasing the cabbage's juices. And after that, we're going to mix it again. And from there, you can let it rest for another 1 to 2 hours or less. I decided for about 10 minutes it was probably fine, but your mileage may vary if you decide to try this yourself. Now we are going to take our seasoned cabbage and stuff it into a clean and ideally sterilized 1-quart jar. Using a wooden or non-reactive metal spoon, we're going to push it into the jar. That accomplished, we need to make our brine, which our recipe says should be 1 teaspoon of pickling salt, or pink salt in our case, per 1 cup of slightly warmed water until it reaches the top of our jar. Just under 3 cups of brine later, our jar is filled to the brim, and all that remains to be done is to wait for our fermentation to start. Now, since I'm not using a mason jar, but a clamp lid jar, I'm going to have to burp the jar once or twice a day so that the gases created by our lactic acid fermentation can escape. Because if they don't, there's always the chance it could cause the jar to explode, which is generally not something you want to have happen. Now, full disclosure, about 8 hours after filming this, I opened the jar for the first time and brine got absolutely everywhere. This suggested to me that I should probably drain some of the brine and just use a stainless steel spring in order to keep our cabbage submerged in the brine while also allowing it to be less messy. That being said, after a couple of days I realized I had made a mistake. I had measured my salt by volume, not by weight. pickling salt is generally finely ground, while the Himalayan pink salt I used was coarser and generally larger in shape. Naturally, this means that a teaspoon of our Himalayan pink salt weighed probably a fair bit less than our pickling salt would, which also means that there's a chance I didn't add enough for our brine to be, well, a brine. For me, this begs a couple of questions. What is the minimum amount of salt required in order to make our brine safe against the bad bacteria? Additionally, which is better, a weak brine or a strong one? Fortunately, I remembered I had this chart, which offered an easy way to napkin math my way into an answer. Even if our teaspoon of pink salt only weighed half as much as the fine-grained pickling salt, which I measured out to be just under 5 grams per teaspoon, it would still be more than the 2 grams per cup required to get us to the 1% salt to water ratio required for our brine to let our good bacteria outproduce our bad bacteria. Combined with the extra 2 teaspoons of pink salt added during our dry brine session, we are easily in the territory of a brine measuring pretty close to 4%. As for the positives and negatives of weaker versus stronger brines, it all comes down to finding a balance. A weaker brine doesn't suppress bacterial growth as effectively as a stronger brine. This is something with a bit of a double edge. It allows for faster fermentation because the lactobacillus bacteria and other potentially beneficial microbes are not suppressed, which means this is excellent in cooler weather where fermentation might need some help getting started. However, it also has a greater chance of harmful bacteria overtaking our good bacteria. A stronger brine minimizes the risk of bad bacteria taking hold of our fermentation process, but it also slows the process as our good bacteria will have to fight harder in order to get the right ecology going. A stronger brine is often best used in warmer weather, with the added heat allowing for more complex flavors to be achieved in the process. However, there is also the risk of the brine being too strong, at which point the fermentation process won't happen at all. So, it's been about a week since we started our fermentation process. As you can see, there's a lot of cloudiness, but I'm pretty sure that's all just from the pink salt that we used, just the minerals hanging around and stuff. And everything on top and around it looks safe to eat, so let's give it a shot. So, here we have our sauerkraut. Smells sauerkrauty. It definitely has a hint of something else in it too. Probably all the spices I threw in there, but I've never really worked with juniper berries before, so I'm not sure what that whole thing is about. Let's try it. It's not bad. It's very just kind of acidic, sour. But, you know, it's not really, sauerkraut is not really eaten, at least by me, on its own. It generally goes with, you know, say, a bratwurst. Making a bit of a mess. It's okay. It's going to be worse than we think about it, I promise. All right. Put that aside. Now, let's give it a shot, I guess. That was good. The acidity really kind of cut through the saltiness of the brat itself like that. I mean, I think it's still probably going to need another couple of weeks, but that's a solid start to a decent sauerkraut, all things considered. I'm going to be a big sauerkraut guy. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. But for more videos like this one, feel free to check us out on YouTube.